So we're in chapter 27 of your history book, going into section 2, and we're talking about the Cold War, but now we're going to get into Europe. We're going to go from Europe and then we're going to go into Asia, what was going on in Asia in the Cold War, and going on then into the Latin American countries, especially Cuba, and on to the Mediterranean area, including what was going on in Israel at that time. So this section, though, we're just going to focus on Europe. And so we see the rise of the Soviet Union, the transforming of West Germany, Soviet leadership, a summit peace that fails, the Berlin Wall, the arms race, the continued tension, and atoms for peace. So this section here, you see we have the presidents were involved. We're not getting involved in these two presidents just yet. So we have Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Jimmy Carter. And the next section after the Cold War, we're going to get into Ronald Reagan and Bush, the Bush administration. So here we have, at this time, we know what Stalin was during World War II. After Stalin dies, we're going to have other Soviet communist leaders. And we have Khrushchev and Brezhnev here. So on these two here pictured, and we'll be talking more about them. And you can see what was going on in the communist regime here. It's in the pictures. This is actually Lenin and the taking over in Russia. And we have Kennedy here fighting communism. So let's begin. The Berlin question. We're going to start with Germany, of course. Half of Germany, East Germany, had been given and taken over that section to the Soviet Union at this time, and then the city of Berlin, and that's where we'll find the Berlin Wall. They built a wall to keep people in, so they wouldn't go outside and get away from the communist regime. To build a wall to keep people in would be like jailing them, right? So at the Potsdam Conference after World War II in 1945, plans had been made for the occupation of Germany. And so they divided 4 divisions or zones of military occupation of Germany. Now, remember, after World War II, Hitler had been defeated, and now what do we do with Germany? And they divided into these military zones. American had one zone, United States had one zone, the British had another zone, French had one zone, and the Soviet Union had the last zone. Well, the American, British, and French united their zones to form West Germany and West Berlin, as West Berlin was divided in half. And they established a new currency for West Berlin in 1948. The Soviets retaliated, not wanting their new currency and everything, and wanting the West to control by creating rail, water, and road blockades in Berlin. So they came in and they started blockading. Looks like we're going to have a total division, and which we did, of the city of Berlin and also the country of Germany. So in response, the Americans established the Berlin Airlift from June 1948 through the winter to save the 2.25 million West Berliners from starving to death. The Soviets came in basically wanting to starve them so that they actually would submit to the communist regime. So during this time, I could say America, the Berlin Airlift was fantastic. America came in, over 600 flying crews were involved at this time, and a transport plane was landing in West Berlin every 45 seconds. Can you imagine that? We're talking about they were landing, tons of planes landing, until the Soviets had to lift the blockade in May. But the airlift actually continued into September. So when you think they were just landing, another one landing, they were talking about constant landing. I'm not saying this was in the beginning at the height, every 45 seconds, not the whole time, of course. So here we have pictures of, they're waiting, had no food, and they're waiting to get, supplies. and how our planes were bringing in supplies for them, and especially the West Berliners were just, they were reaching out. They didn't want to be taken over by the communist regime, and the first thing that the communist regime were going to do was going to starve them till they surrendered. So amazing time for America to be proud of helping these people with bringing them food. The transforming West Germany became an economic miracle. What does that mean? West Germany now had free elections, and basically their businesses basically were now a free enterprise. You can call capitalism a free enterprise, and West Berlin and West Germany would prosper. So free elections were held in West Berlin in December of 1948. The voter turnout of 86% of the people turned out to vote. In 1949, West Germany was recognized as a nation, becoming under the Federal Republic of Germany, with a democratic now constitution and a representative government similar to what we have in the United States. So this is West Germany in 1949. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, he lived 1876 to 1967, and Ludwig Erhard, 1897 to 1977, was the Minister of Economics, and they transformed West Germany from the ruins of a war to one of the most prosperous nations in the world. That is amazing. Consider Germany before, even in after World War I, when they were in the Depression and all the things that they had gone through, and now bringing in, a free government and free elections. They had now been transformed into a prosperous nation, one of the most prosperous in the world. So that was West Germany. Remember, West Germany here on this side was now a free enterprise nation. East Berlin and East Germany, this is actually East Berlin, but East Germany, here's the picture, was now controlled by the Soviet communism. So they were totally divided. But this was considered an economic miracle after the war, and it illustrated the power of free enterprise and stood in stark contrast to the impoverished condition of the communist East Germany. East Germany had totally been impoverished, and West Germany was prospering. So you see the difference between now the free enterprise and communism. Communism brings in, depression and impoverished conditions. So here we have picture here. Here is Konrad Adenauer, and then we on to this here. Basically, one of the things that Russia did was the beginning of building automobiles, and that they flourished in building automobiles. And so West Germany, being that economic miracle, had close ties with France, United States, and a key role in NATO. And anyway, so on to East Germany, of course, was controlled by the USSR right here. It had East Germany basically seeing what was going on with the wall here, So let's go on to the next slide. Soviet leadership. So after the death of Joseph Stalin, his picture of Stalin, and he basically, I should say after the death of Lenin, because Lenin actually brought communism into Russia. And Lenin was very much of a Karl Marx theology, or I should say I wouldn't even call it theology. Marx based his on socialism, or not just socialism, social evolution. Social evolution that leads to communism, and Lenin brought it in first, and then we had this is Trotsky and Stalin, and they had basically strove for power, in the midst of who was going to be in power. They fought for this, and ended up Stalin, of course. Joseph Stalin took over the communist regime at this time, and so after his death, though, which would happen not too long after World War II. Georgy M. Melakov appeared to be the leader, but then he resigned in 1955, and Nicolae Bulgarian held the power until 1958. So remember, the war we're talking about from 1948, 1958, 10 years, we had a struggle between which leader was going to be in control. This basically, Nicolae Bulgarian held the power until 1958, and then Nikita Khrushchev would slowly gain political support in the Communist Party for quite a while. So here we have a picture. We have Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin. Here's Nikita Khrushchev. Here's a picture of him here, Khrushchev. And we have Brezhnev later on, and we're going to get into Gorbachev. How I remember these two is basically Brezhnev. To me, like Brezhnev had the big eyebrows, Brezhnev eyebrow, And then I think of Gorbachev because he had that basically you can see where he had that birthmark on his head. Gorbachev. That's how I get those two. And of course, Khrushchev kind of looked like that. But we had these two before. And so we have Bulganin, and we have Malenkov in this picture here. These two guys were first and before Khrushchev. We'll get into that too. Well, the Geneva Summit. When we talk about Geneva Summit, we're going to talk about, the arms race, and we're going to talk about arms control with the communist nation, and a lot of these were met in Geneva. Geneva, Switzerland was a neutral country. It was a place that they could both come and feel safe. And so the Soviet Bulganin met with President Eisenhower. He was the British President Eisenhower, and then the British Prime Minister was meeting with him, Anthony Eden, and the French Prime Minister, Edgar Faure, at Geneva in Switzerland. So we have, of course, we have Britain and France and the United States coming to meet with the Soviet power. Here's a picture of Bulganin right here, and here's a picture of Eisenhower. The two main powers at this time. It says, no immediate results were evident, but the willingness for the Soviets to talk indicated a shift from active aggression to a so-called peaceful coexistence. So at least the Soviets were going to talk about things. The old communist plan for world conquest and dominion had not changed, though, only the methodology. Basically, they were talking, but they were still believing in the old communist way. So, in fact, when I look at these Geneva meetings and we go into the arms race and these other meetings that happened, basically, I don't think any of them worked much at all. They would say that they had a treaty, but they would do opposite. So at the Geneva Summit, 1955, this is the year, world leaders would meet on our arms race and disarmament. Disarmament meant that they wanted to make sure that they would disarm each other. Basically, they would get rid of their nuclear weapons. That's what they were talking about. And do you think they did? President Eisenhower suggested each side could monitor from the air what the other was doing. Do you think that the communist country of the Soviet Union would let President Eisenhower bring planes in so he could watch them and see what they're doing? We don't think so. Neither could they stockpile weapons, and tensions would be reduced in high point relations. But so they were not to stockpile weapons, and this time we're talking about, because they were testing nuclear weapons at this time, not only the atomic bomb but also the hydrogen bomb. So this was the beginning of the arms race. We call arms race is that race for power, especially in atomic energy. Now we know now that the secrets, the spy rings that had actually brought in the information on the atomic bomb to Russia. We know how that got snuck in. We kind of went over that before. As for the spies that were in America, actually in our government obtaining a lot of our information in our military. So here we go. Let's go on to next. Then the new Soviet premier would be Nikita Khrushchev. In 1958, Khrushchev became the Soviet leader. His new dominance would now first create another Berlin crisis. Why? Because in 1958, he demanded that the Western forces now would leave West Berlin. First thing he wants to take over West Berlin. West Berlin is prospering now. And so he's thinking, we need to take over West Berlin. His proposal is that it would become a free city within East Germany. Did he really want it to be a free city? That's not exactly what the other communist countries' takeovers would make them a free city. They say, oh, it can be a free city, but they would say one thing and do the opposite. So but he stated if the West used forces to hold West Berlin, then the Soviet Union would expel the Allied troops by force. Basically, you guys bring in tanks and stuff, and we'll bring in tanks. President Eisenhower was president at this time and stated that the United States had no intention of abandoning the more than 2 million West Berliners to communism. He said, we will protect them. So Khrushchev extended the deadline, saying, and he asked for a summit. So he said, well, maybe we should get together so that he could force the West to accept his demands that Khrushchev wanted West Berlin. And so Eisenhower agreed to meet, but first he would meet with the other foreign policy ministers in the other countries, especially, of those NATO countries, and, discuss what they're going to do. Because Nikita Khrushchev now was threatening to take over West Berlin and on to West Germany. Well, the foreign ministers met at Geneva in Switzerland in May of 1959. Remember, that was 1958, so we have 1959. So it was a very gloomy outlook for West Berlin because they're looking like, basically, the Soviet Union wants to take over West Berlin. And peace prevailed because of Soviet inflexibility. So basically, the Soviets hadn't done yet what they said they were going to do. But there came a change in Khrushchev's tone. And he started to kind of speak of some peaceful coexistence with us. In July, then President Eisenhower decided, well, I'm going to invite Khrushchev, to visit the United States. He was thinking, maybe we can have peace if he comes to see the United States. And right away, he wanted to, for goodness sakes. He wanted to come to the United States. So he came with his protection. The Premier Nikita Khrushchev arrived and toured our country, and he agreed to hold a summit at Paris in 1960. So things started looking up, thinking, well, maybe if he came and we see that we're peaceful. Well, when he toured, it wasn't always peaceful. A lot of people hated communist regimes too. But you can see here the places that Eisenhower he brought in the midst, and even to Hollywood. He basically brought Khrushchev all over. It was called the Cold War Roadshow, giving him basically a tour of all. And we go on to, here's a picture of Eisenhower meeting with Khrushchev in the midst of beginning this. And here we have, he's like holding an ear of corn. He's in the Midwest and stuff, so he's touring. So what actually happens next? U-2 spy planes were shot down over the Soviet Union. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Bridge of Spies, which I recommend seeing, it's really a good movie that shows exactly what happened, I think. So, but anyway, and you'll see this basically at this time, that we actually had planes that were going over the Soviet Union and looking to see what they were doing in the midst of the arms race, especially with nuclear testing. And so while Khrushchev is here, what happens? Russia shoots down one of our planes, a couple of our planes. One actually crashed and the pilot died. But shortly before Eisenhower's journey to Paris, a U.S. spy plane, U-2, was piloted by Francis Gary Powers in 1929 to 1977, was shot down over Russian territory. Powers then was convicted of crimes in the Soviet Union. He spent 1 year, 9 months in prison in Russia, and was given, but he was then given freedom in a spy exchange. So we had basically put together this spy exchange on February 10th, 1962. Powers was exchanged, they exchanged spies, along with a student, a United States student, Frederick Pryor. The Powers and Pryor were exchanged by the Soviets for a KGB Colonel Rudolf Abel. So here we had, in the midst of all this, and this is the Bridge of Spies, you'll see the miracle that happened for being able to exchange these spies. Quite a deal, quite a movie, but it's true. Khrushchev used this incident to end the summit and to denounce both the president and the United States as spies and warmongers. So here he's touring, he's thinking things are going well, and then back in Russia, they shoot one of our planes down that are spying on him. So right away, of course, Khrushchev changes and says, no, I am not going to make peace. And it looks to me that you are spies and warmongers, and you really don't care to have peace. So in the midst of this whole thing, it's craziness. The Berlin Wall. So at the Vienna summit of June of 1961, now we have a new president, President John F. Kennedy, met with Khrushchev to ease the tensions between America and the Soviet Union. So he decides to get together again with Khrushchev after all this. And Khrushchev became very defiant in his demands for control of Berlin again, back to controlling, he wanted West Berlin. And so Kennedy seemed pretty inexperienced against Khrushchev at this time. Khrushchev kind of looked at him just as a young president and figured that he didn't know, as much as when he was dealing with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower being a general. So Kennedy basically, going there, he just thought this is not working out. So Khrushchev created a new Berlin crisis by declaring that the Soviet Union now would make a separate peace treaty with East Germany, and he would take West Berlin, the city of West Berlin, by force. So in July 25th of 1961, President Kennedy proposed a national address to increase the United States Army troops by 200,000 and United States defense spending by $3.25 billion to meet the Soviet threat. So basically Kennedy says, okay, we got to do something. So he gave an address, in front of the United States. It says we need to bring troops over there now because he's going to come and he's going to take over these poor people now in West Berlin. And so he spent the money, he brought in the troops on August 13th. The East German regime built the Berlin Wall to keep East Berliners from escaping to freedom in the West. So what the communist nation said, brought in, they said, we're going to build a wall, because all of a sudden they knew America was coming in. Kennedy was sending troops in to help him. And so even the East Berliners thought, we want to go over on their side. And so what they had to do is they had to build this wall bigger. And now the wall, anybody that would try to get out, it actually even divided families. Can you imagine that? That they wouldn't be able to see their families that maybe lived in West Germany or West Berlin. And so anyone that would try to escape in any way were shot and killed on the way. And so here we have all these people now caught, in the communist East, Berlin, and this wall, just dark contrast of this wall right now set up to keep communist, to keep communism at bay and to keep these people subject to communism. Kennedy calls up National Guard reserves. So events moved quickly as Kennedy called up 145,000 National Guardsmen and military reserves. So he calls these up on August 19th. Vice President Johnson then arrives in West Berlin for a 2-day mission for the president. And on August 20, the West Berliners line the streets and cheer as a force of 1,500 United States troops arrived to reinforce the Western garrison. So the West Berliners here, you can see, are cheering, coming in. First, the Vice President Johnson comes in, and then tensions are running high, and President Kennedy decides to personally go and visit West Berlin in June of 1963. He's going into a very dangerous area at this time, Kennedy and Johnson. Later on we'll see, of course, Kennedy will get assassinated, my goodness, in Texas. And here he was going to Berlin, which is much more dangerous and coming out without problems, Anyway, but the Berlin Wall did remain in place. It never was taken down at this time, but it was taken down, we'll find, in 1989. And that's going to be a great day. That's under Ronald Reagan. But the East Berliners were forced now to live under the communist regime. But we did have the visits to West Berlin and that protection with Kennedy and Johnson coming. Kennedy be the president and Johnson the vice president. The arms race and the atomic bomb control. So the fear of nuclear war came with the Soviet expansion. And the arms race began as other nations desired to possess both the atomic bomb and the new hydrogen bomb. So to meet these threats, the United Nations set up an International Atomic Energy Agency called AEA. The United States submitted a plan for an Atomic Energy Commission to control the uses of atomic energy. So, in fact, we have Eisenhower bringing for atoms for peace. So using atomic energy in other ways besides bombs. And so this international agency would have the right to inspect all atomic energy plants through the world. So anybody that had an atomic energy plant, this would give them the right that we could come in, this agency could come in and inspect to make sure your atomic plant was safe. So the Soviet Union opposed it, of course. And they opposed any attempt to permit outside agencies to inspect their plants. And they suggested that the members of the United Nations sign an agreement that would outlaw the use of atomic weapons. So they're saying, okay, yes, let's outlaw atomic weapons in the United States. So in a way they were saying, you could do it. Let's outlaw it. Let's get them to outlaw it, but we're not going to really outlaw it. We'll still have ours, but then we could have atomic weapons and they won't, right? Well, anyway, they demanded that the United States would destroy or dismantle all of her nuclear weapons prior to any agreement that they had. So basically the arms race would turn out not so good in atomic bomb control. And so, of course, the Atomic Energy Commission, this whole thing reached a dead end because they couldn't, you see here in the midst here of Kennedy and Khrushchev, wrestling with atomic warfare, the arms race. And of course, it was the age of anxiety now in the 1950s. Because of the development of atomic weapons, the world became very intense. The United States conducted a series of nuclear tests in the late 1940s and the early 1950s with the hydrogen bomb test. First we had the atomic bomb, and now we have the hydrogen bomb, which is so much stronger, more energy, more TNT. When you say TNT, you say that the strength of TNT bomb. And so the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb in 1949 in a test, and the hydrogen bomb in 1953. The Tsar bomb, they called it RDS-220. Other nations followed and tested their nuclear weapons, and the Soviet penetration of the outer space with their artificial satellites extended the arms race to space, all the way to space. So the United States now launched several satellites into orbit, but the Soviets were far in the lead in the space. And they had the space research and development, and they were already ready to send bombs into space. And they were ahead of us. So here's some pictures of the bombs. This, the hydrogen bomb. Here's Here's another bomb in the midst of the desert here, and the bomb that goes out is tested in the, I think it's the Nevada desert of the United States test. And we have, of course, the bombs being tested in communist states, especially in Soviet Union. Disarmament failures. So despite the East and West's continued warning of potential harmful radioactive fallouts of atmospheric nuclear testing, the Soviet announced in August of 1961 that they were resuming atmospheric nuclear testing with a 3-month series of 30 tests, 30 bombs they were going to put off. 3 months, they said in 1961, we're just going to be testing all of our bombs, 30 of them. So Khrushchev then rejected any request to refrain from nuclear testing their weapons. So we're going to test our weapons, we don't care, which they did in Russia and in Siberia and other places. The United States resumed nuclear testing by exploding a low-yield bomb underground at a test site in Nevada. So here's a picture of the Nevada test. So we too, since they were doing it, we had tested ours. Here's the United States looking and testing that underground bomb in Nevada. Both these pictures have to do with that one. The Soviets then detonated the Tsar bomb, a 50 megaton hydrogen bomb, 50 million tons of TNT. In spite of the UN request that they refrain from doing so, they tested this huge, gigantic hydrogen bomb. On January 29th of 1962, after 39 months of negotiations at Geneva, trying to negotiate this, a joint American, British, and Russian nuclear test ban treaty came to an unsuccessful conclusion in banning. They could not agree on banning nuclear weapons. The SALT treaties. SALT treaties are strategic arms limitations. So first under President Johnson, after Kennedy, Kennedy was assassinated, President Johnson became president, and then in 1967 announced the Soviets were building missile defense systems, and they knew. So President Johnson met with Premier Alexei N. Koyskin of New Jersey for strategic arms limitation talks. So he met in New Jersey, not of New Jersey. They met in New Jersey with the Russian premier. And President Nixon in 1969 negotiated with the leaders of Communist China. We have Communist China now with nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union in an attempt to terminate the Cold War. So Nixon going to China too. His Secretary of State was Henry A. Kissinger, and Kissinger was the spokesman for détente. Détente means official policy that lessens hostility. Let's ease hostility between nations. And so Kissinger was then, here's a picture of him, was basically the Secretary of State, was responsible to trying to put forth détente in these areas, which a lot of it didn't work. The SALT treaties didn't work, just to say that. A lot of people say a lot of good things about Kissinger. I think that he made some big mistakes myself. I don't look at him as that. He got the Pulitzer Prize, I think, or Peace Prize and all these, and which, I'm not sure, if he really was bringing forth peace at these times, but a lot of the so-called peaceful negotiations didn't turn out as they were so peaceful. And we go get into Vietnam, and we'll get into those things later. So Nixon and Kissinger met with the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev of Russia for the strategic arms limitation. When you ever see SALT, it's strategic arms limitation. There's SALT 1 and SALT 2. Neither one of them worked. I'm just telling you. The United States and the Soviet Union agreed to limit the production of nuclear arms. But did they? But the Soviet Union had no intention to keep the treaty. They just signed it and said, okay, we'll do it. But they never did. So we'll find that out. So these are the SALT treaties. And the first SALT treaty was when Nixon, President Nixon, who was after, came after, Johnson. You have Johnson first meeting, trying to meet. Now we have the next president is Nixon, and he has Kissinger here and trying to meet and discuss these problems. And they also went into China and met. SALT 2 was under President Jimmy Carter. So now we got President Ford and Premier Brezhnev, the basically what happened then, we know that Nixon resigned because of the Watergate. We went over that. And now President Ford and Premier Brezhnev outlawed the framework for another SALT agreement, SALT II. SALT I didn't work, right? But nothing was finalized under Ford. And then the next election, President Jimmy Carter became president, and he also tried to make peace with the Soviet Union. So in June of 1979, SALT II disarmament agreement was signed by Carter and Brezhnev. So they signed it. Carter's like, yay, we signed it. We're going to have peace. You remember? Carter's like kind of a weak president. He just believes that now they're going to do what they said they're going to do. But do they? So the agreement called for further reduction of nuclear warheads and missiles, giving greater weapons advantage to the Soviets. And so you see here's Carter, and he's signing a little agreement bomb, but Russia and the Soviet Union has bigger bombs. His picture here, signing in a bigger, thing here. And the SALT treaty being, here's him and Brezhnev, like, yay, we're going to have peace. We're going to limit our arms. We're not going to make any more bombs. Really? What do you think? So what happened right after this? Like 6 months later, the Soviet invades Afghanistan. And all the debates ended with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And so President Carter was shocked. Like, I thought we had peace. I thought they signed this and now we're at peace. But he realized, he said, yeah. He realized 6 months later, now communists now go into and invade Afghanistan and taking over the country and using their bomb status, And so President Carter was shocked at the behavior of the communists, and he canceled the sale of high technology and American grain to the Soviets. He said, well, we're not going to give them any more technology. Well, we probably should have stopped that long ago, because they had probably just as much technologies as us. And then the American grain to the Soviets, he decided not to give grain. So here we have Carter mad, thinking he was everything. Even Brezhnev gave him a hug and kissed him on the cheek, like everything's good. Yeah, right. Kind of like Judas did, The United States then boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. So here we have Jimmy Carter saying, okay, I was wrong. SALT II didn't work. And now we're having more problems, and we're not going to go to the Olympics. We were going to have the Olympics in Moscow, for goodness sakes. And he's like, no, the war is going to go on. They're moving into Afghanistan. So now there's continued tension. Both the United States and the Soviet Union, over the course of the Cold War, attempted to negotiate peace arms, production or issue of communist expansion. So basically, I was ongoing, trying to make peace, right? And these meetings each time brought eager anticipation of peace, like, oh, yay, whether it was Eisenhower, whether it was Kennedy, or whether it was Johnson, or whether it was, Exports the Salt, Nixon, and on to, Jimmy Carter, Ford and Jimmy Carter, all trying to make peace. But no agreement was reached. And one side did not cooperate with the treaty. Basically, the Russians never did. Here's Brezhnev shaking with Nixon, and they both have arms in their arms, so, but anyway, so the Cold War tensions kept flaring up. And to many Americans, it looked as though the Cold War would never end, and the Soviet Union would continue to expand throughout Europe and even beyond. So continued tensions. We're going to get into the next section, and we're going to get into more problems, almost a world war when we get into Asia. And we're going to be talking now about, China. We're going to talk about Vietnam. We're going to talk about Korea. We're talking about these some other communist nations involved. So this last thing was a little deal on Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was perhaps the most influential person in dictating Cold War foreign policy. Not that it worked out, but after Kissinger and his family had come to America in 1938 to flee Nazi persecution, he served in the Army during World War II and then earned his PhD from Harvard in the years after the war. So he came and fled to the United States from Nazis. And Kissinger played a large role in changing U.S. policy on strategic planning, and he served in various government advisory roles under Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, and as a national security advisor under Nixon. So many presidents. He just actually died, in 2023 at the age of 100 years old. So he also served under Presidents Nixon and Ford. So when you think of Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, under all the presidents. So his many achievements include helping begin those SALT treaties, which never came through, and in negotiating ceasefire in Vietnam, which was a horrible war. And you think should have had ceasefire or should have had different policies long before that. And then also resuming relations with communist China and working in the Yom Kippur War in Israel. We'll go over those later. For his work in helping end the Vietnam War, Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973. And he formally left politics after the Ford administration, but then he was called also under President Reagan, called him, and he advised Reagan. So he also advised George H.W. Bush and George Bush to help governments in various ways. His efforts to shape American foreign policy during the Cold War were effective. In some cases, they weren't, but in some cases they were. And his influence is still seen in America's foreign policy. So this is in your book, so you can read about this in the book. And again, he just died just in 2023, and he was 100 years old. So I'm going to add that to this, but now we're going to we're going through the Cold War, and now we're going to get into Asia. This was all about Europe. Now we're going to get into what's going on with communism in Asia, especially focusing on China and Vietnam, and onto Indochina area.